Okay, up here.
Hello
Yep.
and welcome
Okay.
to our class on C.S. Lewis. Very few Christian writers have captured the popular imagination like C.S. Lewis. Since the 1940s, his books have sold over 250 million copies and have been translated into more than 50 different languages, making him perhaps the most widely read Christian author since St. Paul. Over the past 50 years, hundreds of biographies and studies of Lewis have been published. He's also been the subject of thousands of scholarly articles, essays, and book reviews, hundreds of master's and doctoral dissertations and theses, numerous video and DVDs, countless internet sites, and hundreds of courses in American seminaries, universities, and colleges. At least 2 major motion pictures, both titled Shadowlands, based on his life, have been produced, and his fictional work, The Chronicles of Narnia, is one of the most popular and children's works in history. Several film versions of the Narnia stories have been made, including the recent Walden Media Disney productions, with more to come. There have also been a number of Broadway and off-Broadway plays based on Lewis's life and writings. Numerous Lewis societies and reading groups exist around the world, including one here in Arizona, where I am, and one in Southern California, several of which produce scholarly journals or newsletters. Lewis has also been on the cover of Time magazine, Christianity Today, and had featured articles in such magazines as Newsweek, the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, and the Atlantic Monthly. Moreover, his influence on a number of famous and powerful people has been considerable. He's been quoted and read by most, if not all, recent U.S. presidents, including the first President Bush, who cited Lewis in his famous 1,000 Points of Light speech. Finally, despite Lewis's own expectation that nobody would read his books after his death, he continues to speak to men, women, and children throughout the world in ways that not only inform, but also provide new approaches to thinking about the world. These factors compel us to ask, what has been responsible for Lewis's popularity and enduring influence, especially in the United States? Well, the reasons for this are numerous, but let me cite just 2. First of all, in addition to his highly respected scholarly work in medieval and Renaissance literature, Lewis wrote a substantial number of books and essays covering a vast range of topics, including Christian apologetics, imaginative literature, science fiction, ethics, poetry, letters, social and cultural criticism, and autobiography. Lewis was an astonishingly accomplished and prolific writer. His many works have enthralled and inspired readers throughout the world. They have successfully transcended nationality, language, culture, race, gender, and age. They have brought untold numbers of skeptics and seekers to religious faith, and they have sustained countless others in their Christian pilgrimage. Second, Lewis was a remarkable and likable figure who became the leader of an extraordinary and influential literary circle in Oxford called the Inklings. The longer we live with Lewis, the easier it is to recognize his genius, his remarkable virtuosity, and his astonishing originality. At the same time, Lewis was no saint. Like each of us, he experienced fear and failure, rejection and despair, and loss of confidence. Perhaps it is this paradox surrounding Lewis and his life, genius and humility, certitude and insecurity, saint and sinner, that provides an important clue to unlocking the secret of his abiding influence and appeal. So, who was C.S. Lewis? You will never get to the bottom of him, or so remarked J.R.R. Tolkien when describing his friend and colleague C.S. Lewis. And there is much truth and wisdom in this remark. No biographer, certainly no filmmaker, has ever captured the real essence of C.S. Lewis. Not even Lewis himself in the pages of his own autobiography. So how can we expect to come to know C.S. Lewis? Well, I suppose we can't, at least not completely. But one of the things that Lewis personified, and one of the important lessons that he teaches us, is that we live with contradictions, with limitations, and with mystery. And in getting to know C.S. Lewis, we experienced all of these. That is to say, Lewis's life was riddled with complexities and to some extent contradictions. Thus, no matter how hard we try, there are aspects of his life and personality that simply defy comprehension. What remains beyond our grasp, our understanding, is a mystery. That mystery will emerge later. Let's begin now with what we know. First, what did Lewis look like? In 1954, Lewis received a letter from a class of elementary school students from Rockville, Maryland, who asked him to describe himself. In reply, he wrote, "I'm tall, fat, rather bald, red-faced, double-chinned, black-haired, and have a deep voice and wear glasses for reading." Second, what did he typically wear? Lewis wore wool slacks, a tweed jacket and tie, often food-stained and rather threadbare, with scuffed and worn hard shoes. In the winter, as we see pictured here, he added an overcoat and a hat. Third, where did Lewis live? From 1930 to 1963, he lived with his brothers at a house called the Kilns, a rather modest and then run-down place on the eastern edge of Oxford. Numerous others also lived there with him from time to time, but more on that later. Prior to that, or from 1919 to 1930, Lewis lived in college rooms at Oxford, but that too is not a simple topic, as we will come to see. So, if Lewis didn't care much about his own appearance, or the size and condition of the house he lived in, what did he care about? In short, where did his passion lay? First of all, in friendship, in good company, and in conversation, in good books and stories, in the correct use of words, in logic and reason, and the correct use and argument, in good poetry, and especially in the pursuit of truth and meaning. Most people think of Lewis as English, but he was actually born and raised, until about the age of 10, in Ireland. This mistake is understandable, given that from the age of 10 until he died, except for 18 months during the First World War, Lewis lived entirely in England and is closely identified with English literature, which he loved, studied, and wrote about extensively. This mistake is also understandable, given that Lewis's Irish family roots were pretty unusual. He was born in Northern Ireland in 1898 to an Anglo-Irish family of Welsh and Scottish ancestry, and with deep Anglican, not Catholic or Presbyterian roots. His father, Albert, and his mother, Florence, were scholarly professionals with eclectic taste and a penchant for book collecting, reading, and literature, traits that they passed on to their two sons. Jack, as Lewis was always called, and his brother Warren, or Warnie, both learned to read at an early age, and they were encouraged to use the large family library without any censorship. This is a painting of the house that Lewis was born in Belfast, called Dundela Villas. The family lived here from 1898 to 1905. And here's a picture of Lewis, his mother in the background, his brother, and a couple of cousins who lived just down the road in front of Dundela Villas. In 1905, with his father enjoying some considerable success as a lawyer, the family moved into a much larger house named, ironically, Little Lee. This remained the family home until his father's death in 1929. This is a photograph of how the house looks today. It's still standing on the edge of Belfast. What's important to note here is that the first 10 years or so of Lewis's life were the happiest he ever experienced throughout his childhood. This is a picture of the family, his father on the right, Lewis and his brother in the middle of the picture, and a couple of cousins, his mother, I think an aunt or two, and a couple of their domestic servants, all in front of Little Lee. Another picture of Lewis from his childhood, here with his brother Warnie, about 1906, would have been about age 8, out on their bicycles. Lewis described this happy chapter in his life in the words of his autobiography. He writes, "There were books in the study, books in the dining room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds." On rainy days, and there were many rainy days in Northern Ireland, Lewis pulled volumes off the shelves and entered into imaginative worlds created by authors such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Edith Nesbit, Mark Twain, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. After Warnie was sent off to boarding school in England in 1905, Lewis withdrew further into an imaginative or make-believe world. A world, as he described it, of dressed and talking animals and knights in armor. This imaginative world was christened by Lewis and his brother as Boxen, a place that they created, but which was extended by Jack after Warnie's departure for boarding school. This was Lewis's first attempt at authorship, but it was only the beginning of a lifelong love affair with literature and imagination. Lewis's childhood happiness came to a sudden and tragic end, however, in 1908 with the death of his mother. This occurred just 3 months prior to his 10th birthday, and he was deeply damaged by her passing. In Surprised by Joy, he writes that when his mother died, grief was overwhelmed by terror at the sight of her dead body. Lewis's father never recovered from the death of his wife, and plunged deeply afterwards into depression and alcoholism. For the rest of his life, until his own death 21 years later, Albert Lewis was estranged from his 2 sons, their home life never again warm, inviting, or emotionally stable. It's unimaginable to us who are alive today, but within several weeks of his mother's death, Lewis was sent away by his father to boarding school, and to one of the worst boarding schools in the world, a place called Wynard School in Hertfordshire, just north of London. Now, this was what the English call a prep school. It was a school in preparation, not for university, but to prepare boys or girls, they usually were separate, to prepare them for entrance into what the English call public schools. Now, public schools in England are not, as they are in America, state schools. Public schools are boarding schools, secondary schools, high schools. And so the prep schools like Wynard are to prepare a boy for the entrance exam into one of the many public schools in England. Now, this particular school, Wynard's, was remarkably never investigated by Lewis's father. He found out about it through writing to a London service that recommends schools. They wrote back and said, well, have you tried Wynard schools? They have some vacancies right now. And so Lewis's father, Albert, sent first Warnie and then his son, Jack, both to this school. We'll have more details and more information about this later on in the course, but again, just to say for now, this was one of the worst schools in the world. Now, Lewis spent a little bit under 2 years at Wynard School and was scarred for life by the experience. He was only able to forgive the headmaster who tormented him shortly before his own, that is, Lewis's death. After much pleading, Lewis finally convinced his father to allow him to leave Wynard, and so he returned home to Belfast for a short while, where he was enrolled briefly at a neighboring school called Campbell College. Now, don't be deceived by the name college. This isn't a university. Many of the private schools in England, in this case Northern Ireland, are called colleges. That's simply just an indication that they are private boarding schools. And so Lewis enrolled just for one term at Campbell College, just down the road from where he lived. Not long afterward, however, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, Lewis was sent back to England, this time attending another prep school in a town called Malvern. The school was called Cherbourg, and it just happened to be in the same town, again Malvern, where Lewis's older brother was at public school, a school called Malvern College. And here Lewis was sent with the intention that Cherbourg would prepare him for the entrance exam into Malvern College when he was a bit older. Now, while he was at Cherbourg, Lewis became an atheist. We don't quite know why. There were several reasons for it. Lewis gives some explanation, but the story isn't entirely clear. Certainly the death of his mother convinced Lewis that the God he had encountered in church as a child, the God to whom he had prayed to heal his mother, and the God who appeared in the Bible that his mother had given him. This God was, if he existed at all, nothing less than a cruel tyrant. As such, belief in God was not justified. At the same time, Lewis became angry at God for not existing. In 1913, at the age of 15, Lewis enrolled at the last of his various schools, Malvern College, where his older brother had attended. Now, this is the school that he writes about extensively in his autobiography, with a slightly different name to it. Despite the beauty of the school, as we can see here, and despite the beauty of its settings, really it exists in beautiful countryside, Lewis was no more happy here than he had been at his other schools. Now, every school has its own complexion. These change from time to time, but at the time Lewis was a student at Malvern College, it might be entirely different today. But in those days, 1913 to 1914, Malvern College was dominated by athleticism. In other words, for a boy to fit in, he had to be good at sports. And Lewis was terrible at sports. He had a problem with his thumbs. He had only one joint in his thumbs, a condition that he had inherited from a family trait, and therefore he couldn't hold a ball very well. And so therefore every time a rugby ball or a cricket ball was passed to him, he didn't know what to do with it. He dropped it, which made him rather unpopular with his fellow boys. So Lewis was pretty miserable here. There was also a lot of bullying and so forth, so he had a pretty difficult time here. Now, as a result of these experiences, or should we say this succession of bad experiences at school, by the autumn of 1914, when Lewis was age 16, he had become a rather troubled adolescent. He had lost his mother to death. He had lost his father to alcoholism and depression. He had lost his country and his culture by being sent off to England, which is a very different place than Northern Ireland. And he had lost his faith. His brother had also by now disappeared, having left Malvern to go to Sandhurst, the English equivalent of West Point, where he was preparing for an army career. Here is a photograph of Lewis's dormitory at Malvern, and you can see from the Spartan atmosphere that it was certainly no picnic being there. The one bright light in Lewis's life was his friendship with a neighbor of his own age back in Belfast, a young man called Arthur Greaves. But this too was interrupted by Lewis's frequent absences in England. Their friendship is well documented by the many letters that they wrote back and forth. Lewis's letters, having been kept by Gries, are now published, and mostly in the first, but they appear in all three of the volumes of Lewis's collected letters. In September of 1914, relief came when Lewis left Malvern and became a private pupil of W.T. Kirkpatrick, or, as Lewis and his brother called him, the Great Knock, the brilliant former teacher of his father, who had now retired from teaching at an Irish public school, Lurgan College, to the south of England, to the county of Surrey, southwest of London. As we will come to see, Kirkpatrick had a profound effect upon Lewis. He introduced Lewis to great literature in its original language, including Greek, Latin, Italian, Early and Middle English, and German. And he instilled in Lewis a great love of scholarship. Kirkpatrick was a demanding tutor, and he helped Lewis learn how to criticize and analyze a thought, an argument, or a line of reasoning. And he taught Lewis how to think, to speak, and to write logically. Consequently, after nearly 3 years with Kirkpatrick, Lewis was highly logical or rational, widely read, and intellectually polished. Many years later, in his autobiography, Lewis wrote of Kirkpatrick, "My debt to him is very great, my reverence to this day undiminished." Lewis's debt, at least intellectually, to Kirkpatrick was indeed enormous. The Great Knock helped Lewis prepare, successfully, for the scholarship examination at Oxford University, and the demanding mentor played no small role in his outstanding undergraduate performance at University College, Oxford, where Lewis took highest honors in studying classics, or greats as it's called at Oxford, and later studying English literature. Now let me try to explain this, because the sort of language and everything can be a bit confusing for Americans. A typical undergraduate course at Oxford is 3 years, but the most demanding course is the course they call greats, or what we call classics in America. It's a 4-year course. You take, in the way that the teaching takes place, undergraduate teaching at Oxford takes place, is that you work individually with a single tutor each term. There are 3 academic terms during the school year, and during each term you'll have a tutor. And that may not be the same tutor every term, but generally you'll work with a small group of different tutors depending upon which paper you're preparing for that term. So you will go and you will sit for tutorials in which you'll prepare a paper, be read out about 20 minutes long, and then you'll spend the rest of the hour with the tutor commenting, asking questions, and so forth, and the student having to justify his or her answers. At the end of our first year, there are no grades that go on, but at the end of the first year, a student takes examinations called mods, or moderations, in classics, and then no more grades are assessed until the end of the 4th year, when a student sits a whole series of long written examinations in the subject. So this is a rather high-pressured way of examining students. Now, Lewis did something that is very, very unusual in Oxford. Lewis got a first-class degree in mods, or first-class results in mods. He got a first in greats. Now, the way it's graded, these exams are graded, you get a first, or a 2-1, or a 2-2, or a third, or in Lewis's day, you could go and get a 4th, 5th, and 6th, and so forth. Maybe 5% or less of the students in Oxford at Lewis's time would receive first on these exams. So for Lewis to get a first in mods, in final schools at the end of his 4th year, and then he came back after he graduated and he took the 3-year undergraduate course in English literature and completed it in 1 year and got a first in that as well. So it's a remarkable performance, what's called a triple first. It's very, very rarely done in Oxford, and Lewis was one of the few students at Oxford who have ever accomplished this. So it's a remarkable academic record, and much of it, as Lewis recognized very easily, much of it was due to Kirkpatrick's preparation. Now, having said all that in praise of Kirkpatrick, it's easy to overlook the fact that Kirkpatrick did little or perhaps nothing to help Lewis to mature psychologically, to assist his spiritual development, or to mend his profound unease at being in the presence of women. Kirkpatrick's own marriage, as you can see in the slide here, his wife, picture of Rebecca and his wife, but his own marriage was a rather bizarre affair, and Mrs. Kirkpatrick seems to have played little role in helping to heal Lewis's grief over the loss of his mother at a young age. If Kirkpatrick had succeeded in teaching Lewis to think critically, which he certainly did, Oxford introduced him to a much wider horizon of people and ideas, a number of which compelled Lewis to reconsider his belief in a universe without God. This is a picture of Oxford University, the center of the university in modern times. The famous building, the round building in the center, the Radcliffe Camera being part of the Bodleian Library, the principal university library, the main part of it being just behind it, and the various colleges spread out, as well as the University Church of St. Mary, which you can see just below the Radcliffe Camera with a tall spire. Now, Lewis came to Oxford, succeeded in applying for Oxford Scholarship, which enabled him to attend Oxford without paying any tuition and gave him a very high status, and did very well there, as we've just heard. But he didn't stay very long his first term. Lewis actually came in 1917, right when the First World War was raging in France, elsewhere, and he only stayed for a single academic term, just long enough to participate in the OCT, the Officer Training Corps, which is the English equivalent of the ROTC, and long enough to receive a commission in the British Army. So after a single academic term at Oxford, Lewis went off to fight in the First World War, and he spent, as I mentioned earlier, about 18 months on the Western Front. More on this later, but Lewis was severely wounded in the war and was very, very fortunate to survive it, as was anyone else. In 1919, after again being severely wounded, Lewis returned to Oxford, where he pursued learning with fervor. He and his brother were fortunate to survive the war, as I just said. As is commonly observed in England, the war took an entire generation of Englishmen. About 1 million died in the war. About 200,000 were missing, and over 2 million people were injured in the war. Now, you have to remember, England at this time is a relatively small country, and the people who were the most vulnerable were junior officers like Lewis, who died in much greater proportion than anyone else did. So again, Lewis, his brother, J.R. Tolkien, other members of Lewis's generation were very, very fortunate to survive the war. Now, Lewis remained at Oxford really for the rest of his life. He was employed by the university from 1919. Well, he was a student first until 1925, and then from 1925 to 1955, as we'll talk about, he was employed as an academic at the university, at which time he transferred his loyalties to Cambridge, where he taught there for the next few years. A little bit more on that later. Now, Lewis is closely identified with Oxford, and the reason is because he lived here virtually his entire adult life, and because he loved the place. He loved everything about it. He loved the bookshops. Here's a picture of one of them, Blackwell's bookshop, which is one of the most prominent. He loved the pubs as well. This is one of the pubs that Lewis frequented, the Eagle and the Child, but known in Oxford as the Bird and the Baby. And this is where the famous literary group, the Inklings, met from 1939 to approximately 1962. Lewis especially loved the Bodleian Library, which is again the principal library of Oxford University. This is where he spent much of his time reading in the library. This is the Divinity School, as it's called, which is a room that goes back into medieval times. It was used for giving lectures, particularly in divinity, and still used for giving lectures to this day. Immediately above the Divinity School is this, the Duke Humphreys Library, which is really the core original room of the Bodleian. And this is where Lewis spent much of his time studying and reading, either in one of the stalls you see on the left or down at the far end, in an area which is a bit larger and has tables and desks. So this is where Lewis did much of his study, much of his writing, and where he enjoyed Oxford life to the hilt, really. Lewis made great friends at Oxford. His first lifelong friend that he made there was Owen Barfield, who was a fellow undergraduate at the same time. Barfield was an author, a lawyer, philosopher, intellectual. Wasn't an academic, made his living as a lawyer in and around London, but he and Lewis became friends as undergraduates and remained friends for entire lives. And Barfield had an immense influence on Lewis's life, as we'll see in our next class. Another great friend of Lewis's that he met a little bit later, after he had been appointed to teach English literature, was the author J.R.R. Tolkien, who of course is the author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and many other books at the time. And Tolkien and Lewis were great friends really through much of Lewis's life. In addition to Arthur Greeves, Owen Barfield, and Tolkien, Lewis's other great friend was, of course, his brother. Now, Lewis's brother was a couple of years older. He had an army career, and so he was away much of the time. But when he was on leave, he would come and live with his brother. And then after he retired, at a fairly early age, he came and lived with his brother at the Kilns. And so they had not only childhood together, but they had a very, very long retirement years together. Well, Warnie was retired at least, and Lewis was still working as an academic. But they lived together at the Kilns in a very, very happy arrangement. Of course, ideas, arguments, and debates were and remained ordinary features of life at Oxford. Lewis seemed to be born for this existence. In 1919, at the age of 21, he published his first book, a cycle of lyrics entitled Spirits in Bondage, a lot of it reflecting his poetic expressions that came out of life on the Western Front during the First World War. In 1924, Lewis was appointed to a temporary position as philosophy tutor at his old college, University College in Oxford. This was just a one-year appointment, but Lewis was very glad to have it. Now, again, he didn't have a PhD. Lewis never aimed to complete a PhD. You didn't really need to in English academic life in those days. He had his undergraduate degree in Grace, which focused on ancient or early philosophy and early literature, and he also had his second degree in English literature, and he was therefore was qualified to teach ancient philosophy or literature, or to teach modern literature, modern English literature. So this particular job happened to be teaching philosophy. Again, it's just a one-year appointment, but it was the first rung on the academic ladder for Lewis. Very important. Then in the following year, Lewis was appointed tutor and fellow in English literature at Magdalen College, which is one of the largest and wealthiest colleges at Oxford. You can see one of the quadrangles here. Very, very beautiful indeed. This was, again, a permanent job, and this was a job teaching undergraduates in tutorials. So it was the kind of mainstay, if you will, of the Oxford academic life. Probably 80 to 90% of the academics at Oxford were undergraduate tutors like Lewis. Only a very few were professors like Tolkien, who were right at the top of the academic ladder. Lewis, very qualified to be a professor, but for reasons we'll talk about in a later class, was never appointed a professor, at least at Oxford. He remained a tutorial fellow of Magdalen College, a very prestigious job, but nevertheless not a professor, not someone who is right at the top of the academic ladder at the university. This is a picture of the cloisters. We just saw the quadrangle from the inside. These are the cloisters that are behind the wisteria that we saw. Lewis walked around these cloisters virtually every day. thinking, praying, having conversations with people. This is very close to the heart of where he lived and worked for a long time. This is the chapel, again, a beautiful medieval chapel at Magdalen College where Lewis came to worship every day once he had returned to religion at about the age 30. But again, more on that in a next class. This is the building at Magdalen College where Lewis had his rooms, or where he lived and worked for about 30 years. Ironically, the building's called New Buildings. It was built in the 18th century, but it's been called the New Buildings ever since then. And Lewis's rooms were right in the middle of the building, not on the ground floor, but on the middle floor, what the English would call on the first floor. We'd call it the second floor. And the three windows either side of right the middle of that would be where Lewis's rooms were. He had a bedroom, he had a small sleeping room, and he had a small kitchen. I'm sorry, let me say that again. He had a sitting room where he would conduct his tutorials and meet with students, a small bedroom, and a small kitchen. So really a combination of three different rooms. He probably had a bathroom down the hallway. But this is where Lewis officially lived for about 30 years of his life, in addition to having a house up at the Kilns where he would spend weekends. But during the week, especially during the academic term, Lewis would tend to have his life focused here in his rooms in Magdalen College. Just so you can get the juxtaposition of the college, you can see the quadrangle at the lower part here, which I showed you earlier, and then behind the wisteria that you see on the next to the grass there would be the cloisters behind there, and then through a passageway you would cross over the grass onto New Buildings, and then behind New Buildings would be a deer park. It's an open stretch of land with grass and trees in which they have a herd of small deer who live there. And so Lewis would look out his window every day and see this nice herd of deer, and it would be really just like being out in the country, although you're really right in the heart of Oxford. And then just on the right of the picture, you see a kind of pathway surrounded by trees. This is Addison's Walk, which is a circular route of about 1 mile owned by the college. Again, very rural. You feel like you're out having a country walk, not in the middle of the city. And this is going to feature very importantly in Lewis's life in something a little bit later when we consider his religious conversion. So keep that in mind. Addison's Walk. In 1926, Lewis's second volume of poetry, a book called Dymer, was published. Alongside the generally self-centered life that Lewis was now leading, he also demonstrated a loyal and generous nature. When his friend Paddy Moore was killed in the First World War, Jack befriended Paddy's mother, a woman called Mrs. Moore, as she was known, and Mrs. Moore's adolescent daughter, or Paddy's sister, Maureen. Then in 1920, after completing his degree, Lewis decided, unofficially, to share lodgings with them so that he could more carefully look after their needs. And this all relates to the very complicated domestic arrangement that Lewis had in his life that we will now discuss at a little bit of length. Here is a photograph of Lewis on the left smoking his pipe with Mrs. Moore on the right and her daughter Maureen. This is probably taken from sometime in the 1930s. It's not a dated photograph, but probably from the 1930s. Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore is a very complicated one, to say the least, and historians have disagreed as to its significance and its nature in Lewis's life. Lewis was very cagey in his autobiography. Despite the fact that he was somehow attached to Mrs. Moore and her daughter for many years, took a great deal of his time and effort every day. He supported them financially and so forth. He wrote only this brief sentence about her in all of the pages of his autobiography, where he wrote, "Even if I were free to tell the story," referring to his relationship with Mrs. Moore, "I doubt if it has much to do with the subject of this book." Well, the subject of the book was Lewis and his life. And of course, we now say, well, Jack, what are you talking about? This had a great deal to do with the subject of this book. Why haven't you been more forthcoming? And we have only silence, the silence of the grave, to reply to that. So here are a few questions to think about. Why did Lewis become and remain so attached and committed to this older and married woman. Let me explain. Mrs. Moore was estranged from her own husband, who lived back in Ireland, and she never saw him, but she nevertheless, as a Catholic, was still married and still committed to her husband in a sacramental relationship. What was in it for him? What was in it for Lewis? And what was in it for her? More specifically, what was the true nature of their relationship? Was it purely platonic, or did it become sexual in nature? Viewed from a Freudian perspective, did Mrs. Moore become something of a substitute figure for Lewis's mother? Even more bizarrely, as one of Lewis's biographers has suggested, given Mrs. Moore's exceedingly demanding nature, I must say she was a very, very unpleasant person, and she made Lewis's life pretty hellish for a long time. Did she satisfy some deep longing in Lewis emotionally to be punished, or to have inflicted on him regular doses of pain and suffering, which for some reason he felt he deserved? Now, it's difficult to get to the bottom of this, no pun intended, and the truth will probably never be known. What we do know is that Lewis's association with Mrs. Moore, which lasted from 1919, the end of the First World War, until her death in 1951, was a highly complex affair. It would not be inaccurate to describe both of them in today's language as codependents. On one level, it's certainly true that Lewis did a great deal, practically and otherwise, to help Mrs. Moore and her daughter. For example, he became something of a substitute son after the death of Patty Moore, performing countless tasks around the house, including shopping and cleaning. He'd come by each day after lunch and spend the afternoon shopping, cleaning house, and so forth. He also supported her financially, first from the proceeds of the allowance that he received from his father, although he didn't tell his father he was doing so, and later from his own modest academic salary, and then still later from the proceeds or the royalties he got from his books that he sold. In 1930, after his father's death, Lewis and Warnie provided most of the funds to buy a house in Oxford. That was the Kilns, which I showed you earlier, where the three of them lived in a rather unsettled state until Mrs. Moore's death. So up between 1925 and 1930, Lewis lived in his rooms in college, but he would go up each afternoon and see Mrs. Moore, and then he'd come back and presumably sleep in his rooms. In 1930, Lewis officially kept his rooms in college, but he spent his nights at the Kilns, where Mrs. Moore and then Lewis's brother also lived when he was on leave from the Army, and then after he retired from the Army. Now, perhaps more importantly than anything else, Lewis gave Mrs. Moore, perhaps in today's language, a life. Whereas previously she'd been drifting around from town to town with few attachments, social or otherwise, she now became permanently settled in Oxford, where she got down to the business of living, including the education of her daughter Maureen at a local girls' school. Again, something Lewis paid for. On the other hand, over the years that Lewis and Mrs. Moore were together, the relationship provided him with numerous benefits. First of all, the relationship got him outside himself, that is to say, outside the rather narrow world of the university, and outside Lewis's own small group of male friends, which focused exclusively on books and ideas, often at the expense of human relationships. Secondly, the relationship also taught Lewis to develop patience. That is to say, Mrs. Moore was a very trying, demanding person, and many people who met her said it could only be a saint who would put up with such a difficult, demanding person, and Lewis indeed did so. So he certainly learned a lot of patience and fortitude through the friendship. Thirdly, as an Ulsterman, that is just someone from Northern Ireland, the relationship provided Lewis with daily contact with the real world. That is, Mrs. Moore was herself Irish and tended to be much less affected, that is, more normal, than most of the academics and college figures that Lewis knew in the university. And then finally, Mrs. Moore may also have been something of a substitute figure for Lewis's mother, though this point remains controversial. Warnie provided a scathing assessment of Mrs. Moore. After mentioning her, quote, extreme unsuitability as a companion for his brother, Warney described her as, quote, a woman of very limited mind and notably domineering and possessive by temperament. She cut down to a minimum his visits to his father, interfered constantly with his work, and imposed a heavy burden of minor domestic tasks on him. He then added that her conversation was chiefly about herself. Mrs. Moore was probably the model for the woman in The Great Divorce, Lewis's book about heaven and hell. This woman demanded repeatedly to see her son, to possess him and to take him away from his higher good. Fortunately, in the story of The Great Divorce, her wishes are denied. Lewis's association with Mrs. Moore provided one additional benefit. It introduced him to Mrs. Moore's brother, a man called Dr. Askins. Lewis refers to him as the Doc. Dr. Askins was a highly congenial physician who, during the early 1920s, was incorporated into Lewis's wider circle of friends. What Lewis or Mrs. Moore did not know about the Doc was that he had contracted syphilis during his student days at university, and by 1923 the disease had begun to spread to his brain. There was no cure for syphilis in those days before antibiotics. Before long, the Doc began to have fits. On one occasion, as Lewis described it, he began rolling on the floor and shrieking that he had been damned by Satan forever and ever. Unforgettable screams and grimaces, again as Lewis described it. On another occasion, a doctor was summoned to the house, and Lewis was asked to hold Dr. Askins on the floor while chloroform was administered in order to calm him down. Up until the medication took effect, however, Lewis described him as getting strong as a horse. He was ages going over, and he kept on imploring us not to shorten his last moments and send him to hell sooner than need be. In the months preceding his death, Askins had become convinced, that he had been condemned to hell, that demons were saying things inside his head, and that horrible blasphemies and obscenities were causing him torment. Now, this was a curious experience for Lewis. This encounter with a darker and perhaps supernatural side of life greatly unsettled Lewis and undermined his confidence in philosophical materialism, that is, in the belief that the only thing that exists in the world are material possessions, that there are no supernatural things. And this is what Lewis believed during his atheist phase. As he wrote to his friend back in Belfast, Arthur Greaves, who was a committed Christian, the experience of Dr. Askins resulted in Lewis's loss of innocence and may even have been the catalyst leading later to his spiritual awakening. As Lewis concluded to Greaves, "We inhabit a damned world, and once we thought we could be happy with books and music." Christian history records that when men and women encounter Jesus Christ and become his follower, they are transformed and their life takes on new priorities. If the evidence of conversion is new life, Lewis was certainly a Christian by the autumn of 1931. In fact, from that time forward, many changes in his life were apparent. His life now had a purpose, to know and to obey God. This came to fruition most demonstrably in his writing. Earlier and not entirely successful efforts to become a poet were now abandoned. The Christian Lewis, as opposed to the atheist or material Lewis, now devoted his talent of writing to producing books that reflected in many different ways his new Christian faith. Between 1933 and his death in 1963, Lewis wrote numerous books and essays that had a dramatic influence on the lives of millions around the world, including Pilgrim's Regress, The Chronicles of Narnia, which are 7 volumes, The Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, and Mere Christianity, just to mention a few. Lewis was also a scholar, busy tutoring and lecturing to undergraduates, supervising graduate students, and writing literary history and criticism, including, in addition to a vast number of essays, The Allegory of Love, which was a study in medieval tradition, rehabilitations, and other essays, and his very, very large book, The Oxford History of English Literature, the 16th Century, excluding drama. This was what Lewis referred to as such a large book, and took him many years to complete. Lewis called it the O Hell, referring to its title. These books are still read and admired in literary studies, and even continue to elicit academic respect. Christianity altered Lewis's writing habits. The publication of his Christian books had a dramatic impact not only on the lives of others, but on his own life as well. First, the change was manifest in the mail. Once Lewis began to write popular Christian works, he was inundated by correspondence. Because he viewed this as part of his Christian vocation, Lewis answered each letter, irrespective of the importance of the author. This activity consumed many hours of his life each week. Second, life with fame was laden with other pressures. There were numerous invitations to entertain guests, grant interviews, give lectures, and preach sermons. Lewis tended to accept all such invitations, believing that these also to be part of his Christian vocation. Lewis also became a famous radio personality. During the Second World War, he gave talks on the Christian faith over the BBC radio. Preaching sermons, giving talks, and expressing his theological views over the radio bolstered Lewis's reputation and increased his book sales. With these new circumstances came other changes, not least a larger income. Prior to this, money had always been tight, especially given the demands of Mrs. Moore. As book royalties mounted during the 1940s, however, and continued to spiral ever upwards thereafter, Lewis became comfortable, well off even. He refused to change the standard of his life, however, partly out of disdain for conspicuous consumption, but mostly out of his deep Christian commitment. He established a charitable trust to serve as the beneficiary of his ever-increasing book royalties. Through this, Lewis gave away about 2/3 of his income. He gave this to impoverished families, to orphans or seminary students for educational fees, or to numerous other charities and ministries. In Mere Christianity, Lewis offered a rule of thumb for Christian charity. He wrote, "I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I am afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say that they are too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot because our charity expenditures exclude them." After Lewis's death in 1963, his two stepsons, David and Douglas Gresham, inherited the bulk of his estate, which made them both very wealthy indeed. The outreach of Lewis's books and the impact of his charity conspired to make still another significant change in his life. Joy Davidman Gresham was born into an American Jewish family of Ukrainian extraction. Her early life was spent entirely in and around New York City. Like many of her contemporaries, she was highly disillusioned with the state of the world. Consequently, in her idealism, she became a communist, an intellectual, and an accomplished poet. By the age of 20, she had completed a BA at City University of New York and an MA at Columbia University, and was teaching high school. 3 years later, she was editing the communist magazine New Masses and had won the 1938 Yale Younger Poets Award for a volume of poetry entitled Letters to a Comrade. At the same time, her marriage began to dissolve. Her husband, Bill Gresham, was an alcoholic, emotionally unstable, an abusive husband, and a compulsive adulterer. The discovery of yet another of his infidelities, some 6 months or so after the birth of her son Douglas in 1949, proved devastating to Joy. Not long after this, she had what can only be described as the beginnings of a deep-felt religious experience. As she later wrote, "All my defenses, the walls of arrogance and cocksuredness and self-love behind which I had hidden from God, went down momentarily, and God came in." Lewis's works, The Great Divorce and the Screwtape Letters, had been influential in this process. Bill Gresham, however, did not follow her example, and his drinking and adultery continued. By September 1952, she had had enough. Joy arranged to visit England, staying with a pen pal in London while leaving her 2 sons, David and Douglas, in the care of her younger cousin, Renee, and her husband, Bill. Note, the Hollywood version of the film Shadowlands features only one of her sons, Douglas, but this is not factual. While in England, Joy made contact with Lewis, and they arranged to meet in Oxford. Lewis was quite taken by Joy, and their friendship began to deepen. While staying at the Kilns during Christmas of 1952, she produced a letter from Bill stating that he had fallen in love with Renee, Joy's cousin, and suggested that the 2 of them divorce, that he marry Renee, and that she find some real sweet guy to marry. This, he argued, illogically, would provide an added benefit for the boys, 2 families. Joy then returned to America to try to sort out the mess surrounding her personal life. In April of 1953, after her divorce from Bill, Joy and her 2 children moved permanently to England, living in London. She intended to earn her living by writing. Her first book, Smoke on the Mountains, an interpretation of the 10 Commandments, was published in the United States in November of 1954, with a dedication to C.S. Lewis. Joy soon fell into financial trouble, however, as life in England proved more expensive than she had reckoned. Lewis came to her rescue, on the other hand, and paid for the cost of sending David and Douglas to boarding school. Out of this, and out of their common literary and spiritual interest, their friendship continued to develop. Eventually, friendship matured into romantic love, and they were married twice, under most unusual circumstances, in 1956. Now, let me just try to explain very quickly what had happened. Again, it's a little bit different than you'll see in the film Shadowlands, if you're familiar with that film. What had happened is that Joy had moved, as I mentioned, back to England, was living in London. Lewis then, because of her finances, it was a little cheaper to live in Oxford, that encouraged her to move up to Oxford. Their friendship continued to develop. And then one day, and we'll talk about this in a later class in greater detail, but out of the blue, and much to her surprise and shock, Joy received a letter from the British Home Office saying that her visa had expired and that she was required to return to the United States. This she didn't want to do. One, she didn't want to go back to her life in New York. 2, she and Lewis had began to grow very close friends. And her sons were enrolled in English boarding schools, and she wanted them to grow up to be English rather than America. So there were a lot of reasons why she wanted to stay, but faced with the daunting task of being basically thrown out of the country by the British government, she really had no choice but to return. Well, make a very long story, complicated story short, Lewis, or perhaps Joy, we're not sure who actually proposed the idea, but one of them proposed the idea that they marry, but not in a conventional way, that they have a civil marriage and then they continue to live separately. It's only a marriage in law. This would enable Joy, as a wife of a English citizen to British citizen, to remain in the country. And so this is indeed what happened. Lewis and Joy were married again, in 1956 in a civil ceremony. They didn't, as Christians, they didn't regard this as anything binding upon them. They hadn't been married by a clergyman, so this was only a kind of de facto marriage, and that they continued to live separate lives. But then after that, and it was, again, this is different than the film portrays, the chronology, the stage of events is different. After that, after they were married, Joy then became unwell. She developed bone cancer, and it was diagnosed, and she was predicted not to live very much longer. And in her being in the cancer hospital in Oxford, Lewis, faced with her death before long, decided that he actually loved her, and he loved her romantically, and he wanted to marry her in a Christian sense as well. Well, this was difficult because Joy, of course, was divorced, and the Church of England did not allow divorced people to be married in the church in those days. Changed now, but in those days that wasn't possible. But eventually Lewis persuaded a clergyman to marry them in her hospital bed, thinking that Joy only had a few days or maybe weeks or months at the most to live. Surprisingly, however, Joy's cancer went into remission, and she lived for another year or two. And they had a very, very happy life together as husband and wife, living at the Kilns. Mrs. Moore was dead by then, and so it was Joy and her two sons when they were home from school, and Warnie and Lewis all living together very happily in the Kilns, despite the fact that Warnie didn't, Warnie, as I mentioned, didn't like Mrs. Moore. Well, after she was gone, Warnie did get on pretty well with Joy, but he also found her, like most people, to be a bit abrupt, a bit harsh sometimes, but nevertheless they had quite a happy existence living up in the Kilns, and that lasted for several years until Joy's cancer returned, and then she died in July of 1960. Again, if all this seems rather confusing, I apologize. We'll have more chance to talk about this in a later class, and we'll sort out some of the details of their meeting and their marriage and so forth. Now, illness cut short their life together. Again, they were very happy as a married couple, but illness cut this short. Her entry, however late and however brief, into Lewis's life brought great joy. As he wrote to one friend soon after their marriage, "It's funny having at 59 the sort of happiness that most men have in their 20s. Thou hast kept the good wine till now." Joy brought many things to Lewis's life, including love, companionship, 2 stepsons, much happiness, and not a little worry. But ultimately she brought him much grief over her death. She also helped him to develop new insights into life, into the spiritual life, and a literary life as well. Now, this was not as difficult as it may seem, considering that Lewis had rather limited understanding of ordinary life outside of the academic world. Now, Joy had been raised Jewish, but of course had herself converted to Christianity through Lewis's influence. She also published a work of Christian apologetics, and she encouraged Lewis to renew his own writing on apologetics in particular. And through her influence, he then wrote and published his book, Reflections on the Psalms, in 1958. And then she influenced him to produce what Lewis regarded as his finest book, and certainly his favorite book, a book entitled Till We Have Faces. Her influence on that book was so important. In fact, Lewis confided to one friend that he virtually considered her to be his co-author. Again, more on that a little bit later on. Now, I appreciate that the dates don't exactly line up here. I'm not doing this in exact chronological life. Some of these events and things overlap each other. In 1955, Lewis moved, not his home, but he moved his academic life from Oxford to Cambridge University. The reason for this is quite interesting. Again, as I mentioned, Lewis had been passed over for promotion at Oxford on numerous occasions. The reasons for this are not entirely clear, but plenty of evidence to suggest it probably had to do with academic prejudice at Oxford against Lewis writing works of Christian apologetics or imaginative literature. If Lewis had not been such a public and such a popular Christian author, So the thinking goes. No doubt he would have been promoted many years earlier at Oxford, where he certainly deserved a professorial chair. But despite the fact that many appointments came and went without him successfully applying for one, he remained a tutorial fellow, which was remarkable for someone of his talent and ability and accomplishment. However, in 1955, Cambridge University, England's second university, we call it the other place, humorously, although we have a lot of people at Oxford have a lot of respect of Cambridge and vice versa. But Cambridge University in 1955, in recognition of Lewis's languishing, if you will, as a tutorial fellow at Oxford, created a new professorship in medieval and Renaissance literature with C.S. Lewis's appointment in mind. And it then invited Lewis, without interviews, without advertising it, without any other applications, it invited Lewis to apply for the position. Lewis was rather reluctant to take it because he had lived so long in Oxford, although it was a great promotion. And Cambridge is a very attractive place, as you can see from this picture. But Lewis was rather reluctant because he had so many ties to Oxford. Well, then Tolkien suggested to him, look, this doesn't have to be a problem. Keep your house in Oxford, live there, and just commute over to Cambridge during the brief 8-week academic terms. There's 3 8-week academic terms. They're all kind of on the quarter system, although the long summer vacations are not really ever, there's no classes taught during the long summers. And the academic terms are 8 weeks. So Lewis could stay at Oxford during the entire year with the exception of those 8 weeks. And he could come over on the train to Cambridge sort of on the Monday of the week and then go back on Thursday night or Friday to Oxford and spend a long weekend in Oxford. And then when the term was over, he could go back to living in Oxford full time without having to bother to come back and forth. So that's exactly what Lewis did. And so between 1955 and 1963, Lewis occupied the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University and was very happy to do so. Now, just as a coincidence, Lewis's appointment at Oxford had been at Magdalen College. Well, there was a Magdalen College at Cambridge as well, spelled a little differently. Notice there's an E on the end of it, but nevertheless a Magdalen College. It's just a coincidence that his professorial appointment at Cambridge happened to be tied to Magdalen College at Cambridge. So he came and lived at Magdalen College, Cambridge during the academic terms between 55 and 63. Now, Magdalen College, Cambridge was completely different and remains completely different to this day than Magdalen College, Oxford. At Oxford, Magdalen was a big college, very rich, very liberal, a lot of Marxist, kind of cutting edge. Magdalen College, Cambridge, smaller, less wealthy, more conservative, but Lewis absolutely loved it. Very friendly, very unpretentious place, and Lewis really, really loved it. He just had the time of his life being a member of this smaller college, but he was very, very happy there and spent this sort of last chapter of his professional life teaching mostly graduate students, not teaching undergraduates, but teaching graduate students at Cambridge. Now, let me just say a few more words to wrap up here by way of conclusion. Here's again another picture of the kilns as it looks today. It's been restored by American admirers of Lewis, by mostly American money, and it's a kind of study center for Lewis, and you can actually go and stay there if you like and book ahead. They're happy to have visitors come and kind of do bed and breakfast for them. Come there on courses or just come there and stay and experience what Lewis's house was like and life at Oxford. Lewis, who had been in poor health, died at age 65 at his home in Oxford, the Kilns, on November 22, 1963, the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and the same day that the famous English author Aldous Huxley died at his home on Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles. As a consequence of the publicity and the grief surrounding President Kennedy's death, Lewis's passing was hardly noticed in the papers. Very few of his admirers, his friends, his fans found out about it or knew about his death until days or even weeks or months later. His funeral was attended only by a small number of family, friends, and former colleagues. He is buried in this grave with his brother, who died a number of years later, in the parish church of Headington Quarry, which is very close to his home, the Kilns, just outside of Oxford. Warnie Lewis, his brother, chose the inscription for Lewis's grave. As he later explained, its source had special significance for Lewis and for the entire family. He explained, when our mother died on August 23, 1908, there was a Shakespearean calendar hanging on the wall of the room where she died, and my father preserved for the rest of his life, the leaf for that day, with its quotation, "Men must endure their going hence." C.S. Lewis's letters and books, and the countless lives and ideas that he and his writings have profoundly influenced, both during his life and in the many years since his death, these remain his greatest and his most abiding legacy. Well, that's just a brief look at who C.S. Lewis was. There's a great deal more to say about him and, of course, his writings, but this will at least give some introduction. And I hope will provide, maybe filling in some of the gaps from the works you've already read, works of autobiography or works of biography that you've already read about Lewis. In our next class, we'll be looking at the influences, in other words, what things influence C.S. Lewis, and that will help to fill in some more of the gaps around his life. And in our third class, we'll look at Lewis's conversion to Christianity, we'll examine how that came about, and we will look at the nature of his theology. So all of these things will return to many of the themes and many of the points we touched on today in the first class, but we'll look at them from a slightly different angle, but it will help to, again, fill in more of the gaps of this very remarkable but very complex life. Again, I hope that was interesting. I'm sorry if the recording isn't very good quality. We're working to try to improve it, and we will keep doing so. But again, thank you for listening, and I look forward to engaging with you more deeply this week. God bless.